Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I take a closer look at a special lens, and that is the TTArtisan 75mm f1.5 Swirly Bokeh for the M42 mount. This lens immediately caught my attention because it was marketed in combination with an original Pentax film camera, and I mean, this is 2025 and they could have easily just shown how you can adapt it on a digital camera and so on, but they deliberately decided to market it also to us here, to the film community and enthusiasts, showing it with an original Pentax camera. And I really appreciated that. And then digging deeper, I realized this is actually quite an interesting lens because it is more or less directly modeled after the original Carl Zeiss Biotar 75mm lens, the version 3 of that lens, a classic portrait lens that was famous already in the 1950s and 60s, but has kind of a reputation until today. And this is also why it is quite expensive on the used market, so you can expect to pay around 1,200 euro easily to get into that market. And then if you want one in great condition, it can go really, really up. And here we have suddenly an alternative, completely new, introduced with a warranty, a metal and glass construction that costs $270 US. So definitely a lens worth paying attention to from a film community perspective. So I brought out my Pentax SP500 to kind of be in line with the marketing material here, and adapted the lens to this M42 mount camera and took it out in a couple of portrait sessions. I used it with Sydney, the model from Most Wanted Models, that was recently featured in another video here as well, shooting some Kodak Portra 160. And my friend Lena was kind enough also to come out for some black and white portraits shot on Ilford FP4. And in addition to that, I also wanted to take some tele-photo street shots and kind of details and so on with the lens, exposing some Ilford Pan 100. As always, these films were developed and scanned by my trusted On Film Lab in Frankfurt. And of course, I can't wait to show you the results and take a closer look at this very interesting lens. So what about the features and the optical design? Just like the original, this lens is a 6 elements in 4 groups double-gauss design, with a slight difference that you have 2 high-index lenses in there. And the lens, of course, is visually beautiful, but it is really directly modeled after the Carl Zeiss Biotar 75mm f1.5 original that was produced between 1952 and 1968, and affectionately is called the Big B because of kind of the size that it has here. The lens was at one point replaced, of course, by a better lens, the Pancolar 75mm f1.4 that was introduced in 1965. But until that time, it was really considered one of the best and most excellent portrait lenses out there, and had already made itself a name and a reputation that lasts until this very day, and apparently enough so that TTArtisan felt encouraged to create an homage of this lens. The TTArtisan homage is an all-metal and glass construction that is available in both black and silver and weighs between 562 and 669 grams, according to the website. And I was instantly drawn to the silver version of this lens, find it quite appealing, and also could already see how it would perfectly match my Pentax SP500 camera. So I reached out to TTArtisan in full disclosure and asked them whether I could get the lens for review here. And they were kind enough to send it to me, and I don't get any money from this review. The only thing is, if you would use the link in the description to purchase the lens, I would get a little bit of a kickback, but I'm really not here for the money. I'm here because I was excited to see my lens manufacturer introducing something specifically catering to the needs of us film community enthusiasts and film camera enthusiasts, and I jumped at the opportunity to review this lens. The classic 75mm focal lens is of course interesting. It's ideal for shooting portraits, but also for telephoto street photography. And this lens here comes with 13 aperture blades. and to close it down from f1.5 to f16 and create that swirly bokeh that it promises in the marketing material. But of course, whenever you discuss bokeh, this really comes down to the background of your subject, to the distance of your subject, and of course how wide open you shoot the lens, because that of course affects how the lens will actually look like, and we will discuss that a bit more in a minute. The closest focusing distance is 0.75 meters, and that of course lets you nicely fill the frame with a tight portrait, and I've did that here a couple of times during my portrait sessions, and I really like how that came out here. And the filter size is 58 millimeters, and the angle of view is 32 degrees. The lens comes with a metal front and rear cap, as well as a manual, a warranty card, and a box. And in my opinion, this is quite a package for the $270 that you get. Now, the big question is, of course, how does it perform optically? So what about the optical performance and results? As you can see from my results here, there is a lot of sharpness in the center of the frame already when shooting it wide open, but it immediately improves once you stop down to f2 or f2.8, which is typically what I do for portraits. So f2.8 is my sweet spot, so to speak. And here you do get a lot of detail, a lot of resolution and sharpness in the center of the frame. And yet you also see that mid-frame and towards the corners, you lose quite a bit of sharpness and you have some fall off. In contrast, the vignetting is surprisingly good, so the lens doesn't vignette a lot, even when shot wide open on a full frame 35mm film frame or a full frame sensor. It just performs really well. If you're adapting it to a smaller digital sensor, then of course that problem is not even there. But here for my use case, I was really surprised to see that, especially for such a vintage lens. And yet I did have trouble producing a swirly bokeh. I mean, this lens is called a swirly bokeh lens, and this was my primary expectation, that I would get a lot of swirly, busy background bokeh portraits, and I've tried to force it a little bit here and there, especially in the portrait session with Sydney, having a busy background here. And yet, once you stop down a little bit, what you do get is a really nice, pleasing bokeh, I would call it, that is not busy at all, and just really nicely draws you in, has a nice foreground background transition. You have that typical vintage character, you do have a nice 3D pop, but I didn't get these crazy spherical aberrations that these kinds of vintage lenses like the Carl Zeiss Big B are typically famous for, or also some other lenses, some Russian, the Helios 40 and so on. These kinds of lenses that people go for to create these crazy spherical aberrations, I didn't encounter them here. And maybe it was because I had to stop down a little bit here and there, also because of using film and the light available and the maximum shutter speed that was limited and so on. But I also felt like, what comes into play here are the two additional high index lenses and these small improvements that TTArtisan made to the lens. And to me, I ended up realizing, okay, if I shoot it all the way wide open at f1.5, I get a lot of character out of this lens. And once I stop down to f2.8, I would say, it just becomes a very nice, solid lens, and you can basically have character on demand by switching to wide open or closing it down. And that to me is almost a feature of this lens, where you can say, I don't have this craziness all the time, but I can have it if I want to, and if of course the light available and my maximum shutter speeds and so on play along, then I can just have it, but I don't have to have it. And this I found interesting, how the spherical aberrations here are there, but they're not as prominent and dominant as you would sometimes have it with vintage lenses. So some of you might even be be disappointed potentially if you really go into this lens to get these swirly bokeh, but I was pleased to see that I can have it, but I don't have to have it. So overall, I was quite impressed by the optical performance. Also, I really like the color reproduction. So looking at this bright winter day here with a lot of sun out and still some snow on the floor and a lot of white in our surroundings, I get really, really nice colors on my Kodak Portra here. When trying to shoot against the light and forcing some ghosting and flaring, it performed surprisingly well. Even here it retained quite some sharpness. But again, the sharpness is mostly in the center of the frame, which again is perfect for portrait lenses and maybe not so perfect for other use cases. But I would argue this is the lens that you get for shooting portraits. And at least for my money, you get a lot of lens for the $270 US. And especially if you are occasionally shooting portraits and have M42 mount cameras, I would highly recommend taking a look at this lens here. It's a great addition to a lens collection. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? The lens looks and feels really good, and you can see that TTArtisan went all in here when it comes to the build quality, but that also results in a relatively heavy lens, which we will get to in a minute. In terms of handling, what I really appreciate about the lens is that it comes with a very nice aperture ring that gives you a nice haptic feedback. It clicks nicely into place, so to speak. The only thing is that the focusing throw is relatively long here, so I'm focusing from a short minimum distance to further away, especially during a quick portrait session, takes a little bit of time, I found, and it's not ideal, I would say. It's kind of common for these kinds of vintage-inspired or vintage lenses, but yet I noticed it. Visually, I found the lens quite appealing, and I also appreciated the beautiful markings and the finishing of the material here, so really, really nice and high appeal. There's one important thing to mention about the handling. Before you can even start shooting it, you should align the center line of the lens to your camera that you're using it with. So the way this works is that you would mount the lens on the camera, and there's a little instruction that comes with the lens. And then you have three screws here around the mount that you would unscrew with a T5 Torx screwdriver that is not part of the packaging, but that you would have to have. And then once you've released them slightly, you can turn the lens while still mounted and align the center line to make sure that all the inscriptions are in the right place when looking at the lens from above. And then you tighten the screws again and you're good to go. And I found that remarkable and a little bit unusual, and reached out to Jules, who kind of knows his way around when it comes to manufacturing techniques and so on. And he explained to me that this is basically the most inexpensive way of doing that, letting the user use T5 Torx screwdrivers and so on. He basically said there would have been a more advanced and better way of solving that from a TTArtisan perspective, but of course also a more expensive one, because it would have to make the user, give the user a way to mount it properly and then still loosen it up internally to bring it into position and then tighten it again. And then of course the easiest way to do that are these three screws here. Optically, the lens completely lives up to my expectations, except for the swirly bokeh part. As I've mentioned, you can create it, but other than that, it's just a very nice vintage lens, beautiful 3D pop, a really nice foreground background transition, sharpness, particularly in the center, not so much in the corners. So basically what I would expect. But in contrast to the original, to the Carl Zeiss Biotar, or also the Helios 40 that I've mentioned earlier, This is a brand new lens that comes with a warranty card and that comes with a nice packaging, a metal front and rear cap and so on. And finding something in great condition on the vintage market would potentially be quite difficult and also costly. And here it really comes down to your use cases and what you want and expect from it. I mean, if you are a top-notch portrait photographer and only do that all the time, then investing in a 1,200 euro vintage Carl Zeiss lens, I get that. But if you're more like me and really enjoy shooting portraits, do that occasionally, and want to have a nice character lens that you can bring out when shooting an M42 film camera or a digital camera that you adapt it to, then this lens here makes a lot more sense in my opinion, because you get that warranty, you get a brand new lens, you don't have to be concerned about chasing one down that doesn't come with fungus or balsam separation or similar problems. So this, at least in my opinion, needs to be taken into consideration before jumping at the opportunity. Just because this is an alternative doesn't mean it's better or worse. There are additional factors to take into consideration to the optical performance. One thing to note is during one of my portrait sessions with another friend, I brought out this camera and lens, and he was commenting on it saying, oh, now we're bringing out the big guns, kind of insinuating that this would be a more professional lens here. And I'm assuming he did that because from a layman's perspective, it looks like a very heavy and big and kind of remarkably professionally appearing lens, so to speak. And I found that interesting because TTArtisan is not just offering that for the M42 mount, where it makes complete sense to me, but they also hinted at on their website that they will introduce the lens for the Leica M mount. And here I feel if I'm not adapting it but using it on a Leica M, it would be simply too big and heavy for my taste. And this is the only major downside of this lens, that it is relatively large, but most importantly it is quite heavy, with at least around 600 gram. And this is of course the weight without the camera and without a potential adapter. So once you add an adapter, you can consider at least 100 gram or 150 more. In terms of weight. And the way I noticed it, that usually I use my Pentax SP500 on a revered wrist strap, like all the time, with a 50mm f1.4 original Pentax lens. And once I attached this lens here, I basically immediately switched to a neck strap instead, because I found the weight didn't feel secure to just hold it with a wrist strap on my hand, and it was not really comfortable with that kind of weight. And even when carrying it around my neck with a neck strap, I felt myself often using my right hand to kind of alleviate that pressure and make it a bit more comfortable for me. And compensate for the weight. And this I found interesting, and thinking about it I also thought, okay, this is not the perfect telephoto street lens. If I want that, I think there are better alternatives on the market by now, on one of the lenses I recently reviewed. So I feel like it's a great lens for bringing out for deliberately, specifically shooting portraits. But it's not so great for that always on carry around lens to capture street shots or be on a city trip or so when traveling. This is not the lens that I would bring personally. But for shooting portraits, it's a really, really nice alternative. And personally, I'm just glad to see TTArtisan introduce such an homage lens to the vintage alternative that would be really, really expensive. So it comes down to your personal preferences. For my money, this is a great lens, and especially the silver version here for the M42 mount is a really, really nice offering in my opinion. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the TTArtisan 75mm f1.5 Swirly Bokeh. A beautiful lens that certainly lives up to its ambition and what it promises to do. It's a very nice homage that comes with a few disadvantages and weaknesses, most importantly its weight. And it's really up to you whether the weight keeps you from purchasing it. As I've said, it's not ideal for traveling and carrying it around all day, but if you want to bring it out for a portrait session and deliberately get that vintage look, that Carl Zeiss Jena or Helios 40 look, and just get a very nice vintage rendering with a lot of sharpness in the center, 3D pop, and overall some fall off towards the corner that draws you in, then this is a really nice value proposition coming here from TTArtisan. And in my opinion, if you're just shooting it on an M42 film camera, it's a must-have lens, and if you enjoy shooting portraits. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.